G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe. It was the toy that defined action figure and grew into a globally recognizable brand, one that made its first appearance in February 1964.
Well, I always said, back in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, we were very well defended, between our G.I. Joes and, our toy guns and everything else. We were nobody would ever intend on invading us.
At 12 inches tall, G.I. Joe may not have been the best defender, but for an entire generation growing up in the 1960s, G.I. Joe ignited an adventurous world of make-believe. He was deep-sea diver, a frontline fighter, an outer space explorer. He could go anywhere and do anything. The all-American everyman, who became one of the most celebrated toys of the 20th century. The signature product of a company that got its start selling, of all things, pencils.
Hasbro Brothers started off as a company that sold school supplies, binders, pencils, all that kind of stuff. But then probably in the 50s, things changed for them dramatically when they got more into the toy business and less into the school supply when they created Mr. Potato Head.
Hey, it's Hasbro. Hasbro makes toys. What's new, Hasbro?
Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head with their own cars and trailers. That's what's new.
Mr. Potato Head planted Hasbro, previously known as Hassenfeld Brothers, firmly in the toy business, and pretty soon, the company started looking for a new product.
Along the way, they hired Don Levine. One of his ideas was basically to have this idea of a soldier figure.
A soldier figure that would be for boys, what Mattel's Barbie was for girls.
They created what would be a new term, an action figure. Levine thought of the whole Barbie idea. You have Barbie with all the different fashion outfits, and wanted this idea of a razor blade kind of concept. Buy the figure, that's the razor. Buy all the accessories, that's the razor blades.
Levine also wanted something else, something Barbie didn't have. These soldier figures had to be posable, and not just arms and legs, but 19 points of articulation.
Having the posability and being able to hold a rifle, bazooka, or whatever, was to be able to crouch, do whatever they needed to do was, that was real fascination for kids.
Levine's vision was turned into a prototype and introduced February 1964 at the annual Toy Fair in New York City. It was like nothing the industry had ever seen. Hasbro created 4 figures, each representing the 4 branches of the U.S. military: Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force.
G.I. Joe, U.S. Air Force, reporting for duty.
And all were stylized to resemble the armed forces as they were during World War II.
In the 60s, especially early 60s, there was a lot of, I hate to say it, nostalgia for World War II. There were a lot of movies, a lot of big action movies like The Great Escape and Guns of Navarone. There was a lot of sentiment toward going with a World War II figure.
And inspired by the 1945 film The Story of G.I. Joe, Hasbro branded the figures as G.I. Joe.
They started running commercials, late summer, early fall of '64.
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe, on the land, on the sea, in the air.
That was G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe. I think everybody saw that commercial. Every kid in the neighborhood wanted to get one.
And one Christmas at the turn of the century, toy soldiers marched in close formation across the playroom floor. This year's toy soldiers come equipped with dog tags, hand grenades, AR-15 rifles, and flamethrowers. Warfare has changed, and so has childhood's imitation of it.
G.I. Joe saw instant success, and to keep kids wanting more, Hasbro continually expanded the figure line.
In 1965, they did Space Capsule, but then they said, what about any enemies? So they went back to World War II, and so they had a Japanese soldier and a German soldier.
Sales of the G.I. Joe were steady into the late 1960s, But by the end of the decade, Hasbro found itself forced to adapt to the times.
With Vietnam, public opinion going poorly, that the military end of things was probably not where they really wanted to be. So I think Hasbro at that point decided that they really wanted to kind of make G.I. Joe an adventurer.
The adventure line often included bearded figures, advertised as having lifelike hair, whose missions weren't quite militaristic, but instead daring explorations into far-flung locations. The line lasted until 1978, a combination of declining sales and an increase in the cost of plastic, thanks to the 1973 oil crisis, forced Hasbro to end production on the beloved figure. But G.I. Joe would return, rebooted in the early 80s, as a 3 3/4-inch figure.
That became, I think in some ways it was even more successful than the 12-inch figures, because it had a whole tie into a cartoon series. There were comic books.
Like it did in the 70s, Hasbro adapted, evolving G.I. Joe, keeping it current for a whole new generation to enjoy.
With toys, what you try and do is mirror what's happening out in the kids' world.
They strategically built the brand into a media empire, one stacked on the foundation laid by Don Levine in the early 1960s. A simple idea, fused with the power of a child's imagination, redefined what a toy can be, with a legacy that outlives the figure himself as the real American hero.
G.I.